I'm really very pleased to welcome Patrick. His first book was The Brilliant Network Aesthetics, and then a follow-up book about video game design called The Game World of Jason Rohrer, which was a really brilliant and beautiful looking book about sort of indie games. More recently, he's published Experimental Games, Critique, Play and Design in the Age of Gamification from the University of Chicago that came out in 2020. And that sits on top of his role as one of the co-founders of the Game Changer Chicago Design Lab and the Transmedia Story Lab. We were particularly keen to welcome Patrick to the SHL and to Sussex University for the kind of thesis of experimental games, where the project seems to tie together the gamification of contemporary life and the neoconservative or neoliberal order, that there was some sort of mapping between these two ways of life, and they can influence one another. So we have Patrick talking today about the kind of the theoretical work of his book and the readings of his book, as well as reflecting on his work in terms of developing games and collaborating with others in Games for Change. Just to introduce briefly as well, Daisy Holbrook is a JRA student who will be talking a little later about her own research project onto Games for Change, Games for Education, Games for Other Purposes. And our respondent is Dr. Joe Walton, who will be following Patrick after his talk. So we'll open with Patrick's talk. We'll then take a short break and come back for some responses from Joe and questions from the floor. So Patrick, over to you.
Great, thank you so much for that introduction, Sam, and thank you, Joe and Daisy, for being in conversation, which is the part that I'm most excited about. I'm gonna share my screen and go into a PowerPoint, and I'm gonna do exactly what Sam was suggesting, which is I'm going to talk a little bit about the book and the core argument of that. And at the end, I'm going to move over into some design projects, both video games and alternate reality game design projects that I've worked on with some collaborators at the University of Chicago. So in recent years, games have touched practically all aspects of everyday life. Especially in the United States, games have become a prominent metaphor and form. This is increasingly true throughout Asia as well, where China has become the #1 games market, usurping the United States a few years ago, as well as Japan and Korea, which continue to be huge games markets, the UK, Germany as well. For example, reality competitions and other reality TV series continue to entangle participants with game rules and objectives. Professional sports and esports saturate leisure time. Popular films and TV series such as The Hunger Games, Ready Player One, Westworld, Jumanji, and The Squid Game highlight the centrality of games of competition and chance to contemporary life. Outside of entertainment and cultural experiences, we encounter military training simulations, national election contests, and the market betting of global finance that influence our political and economic lives. And then perhaps the most direct way in which games have risen to prominence is through video games and virtual worlds, some of which engage as many as 2.8 billion players worldwide. There are a number of terms already for this kind of phenomenon that I'm thinking about in terms of the relationship between games and society. We have game space for Mackenzie Wark, ludification of society, ludic society, ludic century, and gameful world as just a few of those examples. So rather than adding yet another term to this list, my book is interested in thinking about what the art science of experiment might look like in this world. But to offer an example of an alternative kind of experiment, I first want to consider what precisely it might mean to think about the category of experimental games in this historical moment. And I think this frame is important for thinking about media aesthetics in general in 2021. So level one, experiments in science and art. And I have to do this ridiculous section demarcation by virtue of talking about games. So within contemporary science, experimental research design stands in contrast to observational design. Observation begins with phenomena that can be easily accessed, directly, if not always immediately, by human perception. Following this approach, observational research includes such qualitative methods as phenomenology, ethnography, and a grounded theory approach. Experimental research, by contrast, entails the construction of cases that cannot be accessed directly and are unlikely to manifest without a manipulation of variables. An experiment requires scientists to control extraneous variables, alter an independent variable, and study a dependent variable in order to better understand causal relationships among these elements. Across the 20th century, experimental frames also extended to non-scientific fields. The most notable areas for my argument are experimental literature and art. Though a more systematic theorization of experimental writing follows the rise of modernism, one notable earlier conceptualization appears in Emile Zola's 1880 essay about the experimental novel. Zola draws from the medical work of Claude Bernard in order to propose that experiment is, quote, provoked observation. Balzac's novels, for example, begin with observation. These descriptions serve as a point of departure. Following an observational frame, Zola contends, quote, the experimentalist appears and introduces an experiment, that is to say, sets their characters going in a certain story. Unlike the scientist, however, the novelist retains control over both the independent and dependent variables. Beyond literature, experimental work emerged across media, incorporating both formal and political disjunctures. The possible examples are numerous, but we can think, for instance, of the Fluxus Collective or Yoko Ono, or experimental film and video work of Stan Brakhage or Barbara Hammer. Alongside the transformation of earlier media, digital media also brought with them experimental modes during the second half of the 20th century. Several decades before what we might think of as experimental video games, we see developments in the broader realms of computational art and software art. Despite the split between technological and concept art, as early as 1970, Jack Burnham curated an exhibition titled Software at the Jewish Museum and the Smithsonian Institution, and argued that computation would redefine aesthetic experience itself. Experimental writing and art have already received considerable study by scholars in fields such as literary criticism and art history. But a broader interest in the experimentality of the popular medium of video games only begins to take shape in the early 21st century. In thinking about experimental games, it's important to consider games as aesthetic objects. Video games are different in a variety of ways from novels, paintings, sculptures, films, television shows, comic books, and more. To better understand video games as a unique aesthetic and expressive medium requires a more intimate understanding of the new sensorium that they open up. This sensorium includes the specific experiences that video games make available. That can include alternative experiences of spatiality, temporality, procedural activity, collaboration, decision-making, failing at a goal, and network sociality. To put this another way, video games are an art form that began in the era of personal computing. I mean, really a little bit before that. It exploded out at a historical moment at which we've moved to a regime of ubiquitous computing, in which imperceptible information flows are a part of everyday life. Though human beings may lack more direct access to the opacity of contemporary algorithms and networks, video games extend our perception into this media ecology and allow us to experiment with it through forms of play. On the screen here are just a few of the unique aesthetics of video games. And as you can see, doing and action are key to almost all of them. Beyond their intrinsic aesthetic properties, games have many qualities that link them to experiment. In fact, a core part of my argument in the book is that games can serve as hosts or media for experimentation in our time. The list offers just some of the experimental qualities of games, including decision modulation, like trial and error during gameplay, world exploration, and safe failure. And to better understand the potentials of experimental games today, I'll offer a very brief overview of the experimental uses of both analog and digital games within military and economic contexts. So level 2, gaming as a technique of analysis. In order to think through experimental capacities of games, it's useful to turn back to a post-World War II moment, a historical period of the early Cold War during which both economic game theory and computer simulations were on the rise. There's now considerable research on war games and military simulations and game studies. Even so, this scene is an important one to which to return in order to understand the ways in which games are and can be experimental in our time. To zero in on the problem, let's consider what I think is an exemplary and paradigm-shifting document from this era to think about the alignment of these two terms. And the piece that I'm thinking of is A.M. Mood and R.D. Specht's Gaming as a Technique of Analysis, which was published by the US Rand Corporation in 1954. At the outset of this article, Mood and Specht articulate a primary interest not in digital computers, but in analog computers. More precisely, they emphasize that their concern is not with computing machines that think, but rather the thinker as a part of a computing machine. The reason for this, they argue, is that machine and mathematical models leave human decisions and variables out of the operation. Mood and Specht contend that fortunately, we have a model that accounts for human decision-making, namely the war game. They take as their extended example the post-Civil War American Kriegspiel that was adapted from earlier Prussian war games. Unlike the Prussian precursor, the later American version came closer to resembling a parlor game insofar as it combined an umpire with a roll of a common die. So in other words, something like Dungeons and Dragons, for instance, that we might recognize today, or tabletop games. Instead of explaining away this supposed weakness, Mood and Specht insist that the American addition to war games is a crucial innovation for real-world applications of games and for empirical thought. They note the following, quote, "This resemblance to a parlor game is essential if gaming is to be used as a technique of analysis. The game representing the problem must be easily playable and must be played numerous times by the same players so they can develop a knowledge of the structure of the game and a feel for good strategies," end quote. In other words, a game becomes an experimental game, an experimental platform, only at the moment that it invites and transforms a player into a human computer who interacts with a non-human game, its rules, its artificial constructs, and its objectives. Though Mood and Specht recognize that a game can harness human intelligence to solve abstract scientific problems, this form offers something even more important that distinguishes it from a computational model. A game offers access to real-time human decision-making that exceeds mathematics and computation. To put this in simple terms, games engage human beings because they're fun. In any case, the fact that games are engaging makes them, for Mood and Specht, experimental platforms to observe how human beings manifest intentions and make decisions. In other words, this understanding of games is that they allow us to experiment on human beings. Of course, the military origins of contemporary gaming are important, but they don't represent the only context in which games are approached as experimental designs. Level 3, neoliberal games. So in general, the field of economics has treated games as experimental instruments. Economic game theory is based on the idea that human beings engage in rational behavior in order to maximize utility. It gives a formal and mathematical structure to decision-making and essentially all social behavior. Game theory was initially put forward by John von Neumann and Oscar Morgenstern in the 1940s, explored extensively by analysts at the Rand Corporation later in the 50s and 60s, and perhaps most fully popularized in Cold War applications of the prisoner's dilemma. People often assume that this mathematical game theory has nothing to do with the games we play today. But for both historical and theoretical reasons, I think that's not the case. In the book, I argue there are a few ways in which game theory is relevant to how we think about games and video games, including their experimental potential. I'm ultimately arguing against this, but this is part of the historical setup of the book. So first of all, game theory elevated game form itself to unprecedented prominence. For von Neumann and Morgenstern, and later Martin Schubeck and Ken Binmore, literally any social phenomenon can be treated mathematically as a game. one finds countless quotations in economics that argue that drivers maneuvering in heavy traffic are playing a driving game, or bargain hunters bidding on eBay or Amazon are playing an auctioning game. This contribution is so fundamental as to be easily ignored, but it extends games from the status of hobbies and pastimes to a form capable of modeling any aspect of economic, political, and social life. Second of all, game theory saw an initial decline in the 1950s because of its perceived lack of real-world applications. However, as game theory faltered, wargaming began to thrive at institutions such as the Johns Hopkins Operations Research Office and the Naval War College in the US. So economic game theory started as mathematical and theoretical approach, but in turn encouraged the use of actual games as a medium for human experimentation. And then third of all, particularly via the work of von Neumann, game theory made contributions to artificial intelligence, automata, and other areas of computer science that would later become central to video game design and AI testing. So these are just a few ways that I think these realms connect. And to clarify, game theory was an intellectual movement and research program. I'm not claiming that it somehow caused the emergence of games as the dominant popular cultural form of the late 20th century. Even so, the proliferation of games as a way of thinking among scientists, mathematicians, and technologists during the Cold War surely influenced a particular ideological and cultural receptiveness to games in the broader society. Even so, other key social forces were also at play. One of these forces is what we might call neoliberalism, sometimes neoconservatism. Neoliberalism is a polyvalent term that is often used to describe an economic policy and a philosophy of governance. The term has various genealogies that stretch back to such coordinates as the rise of the Mont Pelerin Society in the 1940s, Chicago School economic theories of the 1970s, for which my school is unfortunately quite responsible, Anglo-American free market politics by Reagan and Thatcher in the 1980s, and concurrent leftist critiques of market-based policies and privatization. In general, the term marks a departure from the policies of the Great Depression and the planned economy of World War II amidst a growing crisis of liberalism. More constructively, it marks a new emphasis on the entity of the free market, a philosophy of financialization, and practices of deregulation that took a coherent form by the 1970s. Like game theory, neoliberalism gives rationality a central position. Political scientist S.M. Amadei marks this linkage when she writes that, quote, neoliberal subjectivity arises from the intricate pedagogy of game theory that comes to the fore in the prisoner's dilemma game and is interchangeable with contemporary paradigmatic instrumental rationality. She goes as far as to argue that game theory researchers contributed to the rise of neoliberalism by engaging both the design and ratification of the blueprint for the neoliberal world order founded on rationality. Over time, this approach elevated the assumption that rational behavior yields utility to the status of the main motivation for all human interactions that the theory models. In so many ways, game theory helped to transform the assumption into the grounding framework of contemporary economics and politics. Political scientist Wendy Brown has argued that a focus on top-down policymaking does not offer a thorough understanding of this worldview. She writes, while neoliberal policy was often imposed through fiat and force in the 1970s and 1980s, neoliberalization in the Euro-Atlantic world today is more often enacted through specific techniques of governance, through best practices and legal tweaks, in short, through soft power. Brown doesn't ignore the role of policing and security in this transformation, but nonetheless insists on the importance of legal norms and ordinary practices in perpetuating neoliberalism. I'd like to argue, and I argue in the book, that games, both as a cultural technology and a metaphor, have developed into a central form of the soft power that has enabled the rise of and dominance of neoliberalism. So why would neoliberalism rely so heavily on the logic of games? I think there are a few reasons, but I'll give you just one here. So games, perhaps better than any other cultural form, capture processes of ongoing constructivism within formal rules. It's notable that the quality of constructivism is the one that economic historian Philip Moravsky pulls out as the most important political innovation of neoliberalism that runs counter to liberalism's idea of laissez-faire. And this is what he writes. The starting point of neoliberalism is the admission, contrary to classical liberal doctrine, that their vision of the good society will triumph only if it becomes reconciled to the fact that the conditions for its existence must be constructed and will not come about naturally in the absence of concerted political effort and organization. Arguably, the most important construction of neoliberalism is the market itself. Yet for all of its centrality, the market is perhaps simultaneously the most slippery and imprecise concept within neoliberal thought. While there are myriad accounts of market operations, that is what a market does, there are very few accounts of what it actually is, including in foundational works by the likes of Hayek and Friedman. The closest we come to market ontology is via metaphor. For this reason, it's the metaphor of games that is perhaps as important as the figure of the market. While neoliberal thought does not show consensus on the concept of the market, the metaphor and form of games helps to persuade readers that the reality of the market and its generalizability to a social field that exceeds economics. The appeal of a game is specific and visceral in ways that the abstraction of the market simply isn't. Indeed, the literature on business applications of gamification frequently invokes the power of games to create worlds that are more real and meaningful through play, spatial models, network relations, and other medium-specific qualities. Business school gamification gurus Kevin Verbach and Dan Hunter, for instance, note that they write, think of the power of the magic circle in a business context. You create a world to serve your strategic objectives, and it becomes meaningful to other people, such as visitors to your website or staff in your call center. To sum up, games combine a respect for rules that appeals to economic theory with a constructivist and action-oriented approach that characterized post-war military operations and came to characterize neoliberalism. Now, I don't have time to fill in the next part of this puzzle, but I just want to say that in addition to game theory and neoliberalism, the other key mode of thought that gets us to contemporary gamification is behavioral economics. And the behavioral, emotional, and affective realms are ones in which some of the most interesting experimental work of games occurs in our time. So I'm going to offer a really, really quick case here of the kind of thing that I mean. So level 4, Candy Crush Saga or neoliberalism at your fingertips. Now, more concretely, how do contemporary video games bring together macro scale ideologies like neoliberalism with micro scale properties like affect and game feel, basically the way we experience a game? Briefly, I want to offer Candy Crush Saga as an illustrative case. This game was released in 2012 by the developer King. It's been available for browser-based play as well as smartphone formats such as iOS and Android. By 2014, the game was priced at an estimated $7.1 billion and played by approximately 93 million people a day. The game harnesses a common freemium model in which the initial app is free and was downloaded by 500 million people by 2014, but requires players to pay for additional lives and special boosters. And I just want to note that even last year in 2020, the game allegedly still made over $800 million that year. So it may not be as popular as it used to be, but it's still quite profitable. So the basic gameplay of this game is extremely simple and resembles countless other match 3 games. It's a casual game. Essentially, the player must swipe to align 3 candies of the same color in order to eliminate them from the field. As the game progresses, this basic task becomes more complicated as the player seeks more elaborate combos and encounters increasingly more challenging obstacles. Candy Crush is a suggestive case study insofar as it belongs to the broader ideology of gamification as a narrower design strategy. So gamified apps, after all, are often instrumental insofar as they use elements of game design to train players and alter attitudes. So Fitbit or your Apple Watch, for instance, gamify exercise or taking steps. Candy Crush, by contrast, seems to exist only as an end in itself. So it doesn't employ extrinsic motivation or seek to train the player explicitly to achieve any particular skill set. On its surface, Candy Crush only teaches the player how to become a better player of Candy Crush. And yet that lack of apparent ulterior motive also helps distill an underlying ideology of gamification that exceeds any particular discipline or content area. To put this point telegraphically, in Candy Crush Saga, everything becomes economized. The game translates neoliberal values into a designed activity. One's performance on any level of Candy Crush becomes quantified via 3 separate metrics: a numerical score, a rating on a 3-star system, and the placement of one's performance on a leaderboard. Like so many other contemporary games, Candy Crush engages in what Nigel Thrift has called qualculation, which describes a culture characterized by faith in numbers, speed, and an environment that handles various forms of counting for the subject. A video game such as Candy Crush makes qualculation available and present at both the levels of rationality and affect within the sensorium of the player. Alongside the built-in competition and qualculation, Candy Crush captures another central dimension of neoliberalism, the drive of the economic person to enhance his or her own value. As Wendy Brown again contends, today's Homo economicus is an intensely constructed and governed bit of human capital tasked with improving and leveraging its competitive positioning and with enhancing its portfolio across all of its endeavors and venues. Under neoliberalism, it's not only states and corporations that seek to manage and improve their value, but also individuals who create and curate their identities or their brands. In Candy Crush, the leaderboard also offers the option of connecting to Facebook. Via social media, the player can earn extra lives by recruiting and interacting with other players. One can also compare scores and compete with social media friends. The rewards and the engagement of competition, through these things, rewards and the engagement of competition, the player learns the benefits of being connected at all times. For instance, players must be signed in to spin a wheel that every 24 hours yields free boosters that assist gameplay. And then perhaps the most important way that Candy Crush translates the ideology of neoliberalism to an individual or even sub-individual scale is through its use of game form to promote habits in its players. Certainly neoliberalism shares with the framework of economic game theory an emphasis on rational choice. Even so, the most recent phase of neoliberalism is more concerned with non-conscious cognition. Regardless of the neural effects of Candy Crush, journalist Dana Smith writes that initially the game allows us to win and pass levels with ease, giving a strong sense of satisfaction. These accomplishments are experienced as mini rewards to our brain, releasing the neurochemical dopamine and tapping into the same neurocircuitry involved in addiction, reinforcing our actions. So here you have an example of Candy Crush delivering dopamine hits and achieving addictiveness through many means, including a variable ratio schedule that through limited playtime and a random draw of candy pieces keeps people coming back for more. And there's much more to say about this, but that's another part of this. So Candy Crush is just one example, but beyond game rules or objectives, a key way that games adopt a kind of cultural or ideological soft power is via a concept that game designer Steve Swink calls game feel. As Swink explains, this concept encompasses aesthetic, kinesthetic, intuitive, and sensory experiences in which the simple pleasures of control, feelings of mastery and clumsiness, and the tactile sensation of interacting with virtual objects might all happen within a few seconds of picking up a controller. For Swink, there are 3 major building blocks of game feel, and these are real-time control, simulated space, and polish. And though Swink's elaboration of game feel is meant to be politically agnostic and practical in nature, his concept notably involves ideological dimensions. As he observes, game feel is simultaneously foundational and invisible. Quote, in digital game design, feel is the elephant in the room. Players know it, designers know of it, nobody talks about it, and everybody takes it for granted. It's not hard to understand why. If a game designer's done his or her job correctly, the player will never even notice the feel of a game. In a variety of ways that I can't expand on here, game feel is a layer that entrains the body in ideology. In other words, representation matters, images and language matter, but there are a variety of non-representational qualities that also impact how games move and change their players. Gamified apps experiment with affect by pursuing training, labor, and behavior modification through actions more than representations. For a popular example, consider a game that's been around for almost 20 years, World of Warcraft. That game encourages players to aspire to a higher rank, follow instructions, engage in war making, and accumulate private property. And then at higher levels, the game promotes actions that include team building, managing a guild, and administrating resources. This game, in other words, trains players to be laborers and managers, and much of that ideology plays out through what a player does in the game. On the other hand, we also have games such as Marikopoulos' Limb or Anna Anthropy's Dysphoria, which use game mechanics in order to convey different experiences of being queer and pushing against norms. And if I had another talk, these are the kinds of case studies that I would probably begin with and zoom in on to think about alternatives to game feel, basically. So level 5, this will be the last level before I go into design questions. So level 5, other levels. So there's much more to say about this frame, but it basically combines a historical narrative about the interaction of the field of economics since World War II and the cultural rise of video games. And for me, games aren't just a pastime activity or instruments. They're philosophical machines that can help us think through systems of power from the inside out. So I organized the book, Experimental Games, into an intro, 7 chapters and a coda. And each chapter takes up a concept that I think is central to neoliberalism, but also serves as an internal pressure point to suggest ways of exploiting and changing this worldview. So the first chapter is on gamification, and that in many ways continues the work that I laid out here. This is a much more historical chapter. Chapter 2 begins to think about experiment and science and art. But it's also important to note that experiment became a huge economic driver through product optimization and R&D, for instance. So it becomes a business concept. And here again, Nigel Thrift talks about the fact that we have an experimental economy. And for me, when I talk about experimental games, I'm not just interested in talking about something like avant-garde games or art games. The term experimental games doesn't just capture a genre or an alternative value proposition about games. I'm interested in games as artificial constructions that nudge and modulate reality's potentials in ways that allow for observation that wouldn't have otherwise been possible. And for me, games can be more than entertainment or aesthetic objects, and even more than behavior modification instruments. They're instead a way of running experiments with human thought and action. So chapter 3 focuses on choice. Here I'm responding to things like rational choice theory in economics. And I take up a number of different case studies, including the Stanley Parable, the network game Moirai, and the indie game Undertale. Chapter 4 focuses on the concept of control, which is very central to video game play, right? You think about the way you use a controller, your inputs produce immediate outputs. So here I'm interested in the ways that games can be non-sovereign in nature, the ways they can push against control. And here I focus on a number of queer games, including Dysphoria, Problematic, and Luxuria Superbia. And all of these games are either about gender, sexuality, or sex. And then chapter 5 is difficulty. So under neoliberal capitalism, difficulty is largely understood via competition. And I try to create a more fine-grained vocabulary for thinking about difficulty in games via mechanical, interpretive, and affective forms of difficulty. And then chapter 6 takes up failure. Failure has been a concept that's celebrated even in the business world, right? So failure is seen as a useful element of creativity. So I look at games that take up the limits and failures of capitalism itself. I focus on the Games for Change piece Spent, an alternate reality game called Threshold Land, and an iPad game called Little Inferno. And then the final chapter is on improvisation. And here I shift from standard video games to what are called alternate reality games. And I'll say a little bit more about that in the final section. But here I think about the ways that critical making and practice-based research can help us work through some of the kinds of theoretical concepts that I've been bringing up so far. And then finally, in a very short coda, I complicate the common concept of fun and think about something like joy via Spinoza as an alternative. So rather than the kind of consumer notion of fun, I'm thinking about what it means to hold different kinds of opposites in your mind at the same time and the kinds of intensities that can produce. Okay, so final section, and I still have a little bit of time for this, boss level game experiments. So in addition to being a media studies person, a game studies person, I also co-create games with my colleagues at the University of Chicago. And I just wanted to enter a couple of these different processes into our conversation. One of these ways that I've done this historically is through the Game Changer Chicago Design Lab, which I started with a medical professor who's an OBGYN at the University of Chicago, and have worked with people like Ashlyn Sparrow, who's a wonderful game designer whom I work with on other ventures as well. In this work, we work with young people, usually high school age, between the ages of 14 and 20, co-creating games together. So I'll give you a quick sense of some of our projects. One of these, which is a multi-year NIH project, is called Texaco Health Academy. And this was a hands-on health curriculum based on the production of board games. And when we think about health in games, we think about a number of different topics. So we've created games about HIV, about reproductive justice, about smoking prevention, food deserts, addiction, and structural violence and guns. One example is a game called Smokestack. So this is a game in which you play as a tobacco company and you try to get as many customers addicted to your product as possible. And there are many, we can talk about this during Q&A, but there are many reasons why we decided to have people not merely fight against tobacco companies, but become those companies as they come up with media campaigns to put forward their different products. We've also created video games. So we created an evidence-based game about sexual harassment and sexual violence, which we co-created with young people to think about different aspects of sexual harassment. And this game was called Bystander. We're also working, we're completing a game called Caduceus Quest, which thinks about underrepresented young people moving into STEM fields, into science, technology, engineering, and math fields. And this is an RPG that we've currently been working on. So this part of my work, I would say, is still grounded in something like the social sciences. So we think a lot about how effective are these games. So we do qualitative and quantitative studies to mark the effectiveness of these games or their ineffectiveness in some cases. You know, so in some ways these games are experimental in the sense that science thinks about experiment. But I'm also interested in artistic experiment. And here, I've collaborated much more on a genre called alternate reality games. And I imagine some of you are familiar with this genre, but I'll really quickly go through it. So these are kind of like hyper-mediated scavenger hunts that move across the real world and various online platforms. So they could include text, video, audio, scavenger hunts, code-breaking puzzles, theatrical performance. Basically, you as the player are getting interpolated or getting called out to as a member of this kind of transmedia experience that could happen on Twitch, could happen on TikTok, could happen on various websites. And these stories are broken into discrete pieces that players have to rediscover and reconfigure. They're played by large collectives of players, oftentimes hundreds or thousands of players. And perhaps most importantly, they have what is called a "this is not a game" aesthetic. So they don't announce themselves officially as games, which plays with the kind of blurring between reality and fiction, which of course is such a big part of our world with a kind of post-truth media ecology. So these games really interrogate that kind of ecology. I started working on these games in 2010 and created a number that were kind of more pedagogical, let's say. So they included games about reproductive justice like Stork, a game about Occupy Wall Street and the financial markets called Speculation, and a game about underrepresented youth in STEM called Seed. Following these first few years of creating a number of these games, I co-founded something called the Forecast Lab, which I run with a professor of theater and performance studies named Heidi Coleman, a game designer named Ashlyn Sparrow, a kind of like 3D filmmaker and technologist named Mark Downey, and a number of other people. In that lab, we've created a number of games and are working on another one. And I want to show you a short video just to give you a quick overview of what these games look like, since this could be part of our conversation in a moment. So I'm just going to show you a 4-minute video about the lab. The Forecast Lab started in 2017 as a collaboration between University of Chicago faculty, game designers, and artists.
It was initially a fictitious group of scientists, artists, and academics that we put together as part of the ARG Terrarium. And then it became the name of the design group.
We create alternate realities that experiment with some of the most pressing issues of our time, from social justice to climate change.
We're really invested in the development of community by communities and building worlds that invite players to participate.
And so the narratives of these games are stitched together and co-created with players.
We believe that story is transformation, and it challenges us to keep going and keep designing. We design large-scale transmedia alternate reality games.
And you're moving between an email and a live stream and a live performance and an online puzzle and Discord and Slack.
Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, Zoom.
We've experimented with online rabbit holes, reverse escape rooms.
We are developing an acting style that draws from improv as well as gaming cultures.
The project was very experimental, and it was one of the first times that we integrated live actors.
The Parasite was phenomenally successful at creating a large-scale world that shifted from virtual to in-person spaces. And what we learned is the demands of in-person performance, as well as the ability that players could easily connect and shift through different mediums.
In 2019, we created Terrarium. Many universities have a shared book that all students read in a given year. And we thought to ourselves, why not have a shared game? And so we organized the incoming class at the University of Chicago around the shared goal of combating climate change.
With Terrarium, we were able to harness the power of Twitch so that players were able to interact with 4 different possible futures and the characters who lived there.
We were really honored and lucky later on to win an award from Indiecade for the best live action game that year.
The Forecast Lab has been a place where we've been developing these very particular kinds of games that are these wonderful sites of interdisciplinary discovery and experimentation.
They provide that agency for players to, take learning and take control of the situation and run with it.
It's no longer just this passive experience, but it really inspires your audience to be a part of it.
It feels like anything could happen. Media can be combined in all kinds of different ways.
In spring 2020, just as the pandemic was taking off in March, we jumped into a new project called The Labyrinth.
We were able to immediately respond to the pandemic based on our previous work.
And we thought of this game as a way of connecting people in a time of need and isolation.
And with Echo, we asked players to take responsibility for each other as well as for themselves. And we were interested in reinforcing behavioral shifts.
This is just the beginning. We've created 4 games now in a university context, and we're really interested in moving toward other audiences and other institutions.
The possibility of designing for arts community, middle schools, corporations, families, The excitement in this work is in scaling the project. Now that we have developed this infrastructure, we can really focus on the story creation and the responsiveness to different audiences.
Okay, so that gives you a quick sense of like what some of these games might look like and what the live action component might look like. And just to jump through a few of these really quickly, the first game that we made in 2017 was called The Parasite, playing off of Michelle Serres' kind of media concept of The Parasite. And this was a game created for 1,800 incoming students, which imagined that there was a secret society on campus that had been there since the 19th century. We created all kinds of fake documents chronicling that society. And in many ways, that secret society was meant to critique the idea of hazing and of self-reproduction, and to imagine what a society that was open to self-obsolescence might look like. We also created Terrarium, which was the climate change game that we mentioned in that video, which went further beyond the humanities and the arts to incorporate the sciences in a more central way. And I won't go through that video, but we did a lot of stuff with Twitch. So we used this kind of like asymmetrical cooperative gameplay in which an actor in a room, basically a reverse escape room, would have very limited information, and the players at home would communicate through text and elicit different parts of a puzzle that they were then able to solve at home. So we've played a lot with asymmetrical cooperative game mechanics. This is another example of one of our puzzles in this kind of, in another future that we imagined in that game. We also build various sets. Science fiction and speculative design are very key to our game production along this register. And then, happy to talk about this too during Q&A. But we created these two games, A Labyrinth and Echo, both of which were designed with a number of constraints because they were designed very early in the pandemic when we couldn't be indoors at the university and had to move mostly outdoors where we couldn't create sets and things like that. But that opened up a lot of interesting possibilities. And then Echo, which included a lot more sort of player-generated content, I would say, including people creating very, very creative masks during COVID. So I'll just end maybe by playing a much shorter video of about a minute that shows you a preview of what one of the pandemic games looked like.
This is not a game.
Echo is an alternate reality game
To engage around the health pact.
Using a science fiction narrative to creatively approach COVID.
600 students, staff members, faculty members, even medical students sign up for the game.
I'm Scarlett. We don't have much time.
Echo culminated in a live online performance.
One 90-minute block of challenges and puzzles and storytelling.
We built a platform for running that performance. Live streaming video, chat, interactive puzzles. And all of those elements are sort of then suspended inside a seamless experience. Players went to a place and anything could happen.
We knew what was going to happen, but we didn't know what was going to happen. This is like a Christopher Nolan film that you had to try to catch up and piece together the parts.
Echo was fun. The quest got me and my teammates connected.
It was like a breath of fresh air for these 3 weeks.
I think we learned a lot about each other as well.
The challenges, the effort, bringing together just a lot of different groups was tremendous.
Okay, so I'm going to stop there and stop screen sharing, but I hope that gives us a bunch of coordinates that we could talk about a little bit more. And I tried to throw, a bunch of things at the wall for Joe, Daisy, and other people to have more to respond to.
Thank you so much, Patrick. That's really astonishing work, both your own monograph and then this other work you've just done in your spare time with a few free minutes. Really impressive. So let's take a few minutes off. Let's come back at 4 o'clock, if that's okay. And we'll start with Joe responding and then I'm asking a few questions. But if in the meantime, people want to prepare some comments and some questions, I'll invite you to both come on the mic or to put those questions into the chat if you're unable to come on the mic for whatever reason. So we'll come back at 4 o'clock. Thanks, everyone.